Why have the recent layoffs been so weird? Today, we're talking about some of the recent layoffs and how different they are from layoffs that we've seen in the past. We're also going to touch on why so many people are upset about the recent layoffs and what it might mean for you. Now, if you pay attention to this sort of thing, you probably have access to some of the same information. As always, I am not going to name names of some of the companies that we're talking about today. The purpose is not to shame them, but just to help people understand what's going on right now. First, let's talk about some of the recent changes in how layoffs are being handled by companies. This is interesting. We've seen something happen in the last 6 months, which is very unusual when it comes to companies and how they talk about layoffs and the people that they've been laying off. Traditionally, companies have been very respectful of those who have been laid off. It's known that it's a huge impact to people's lives and livelihoods, obviously. And normally companies are very circumspect in what they say about those who've been laid off until now. What's happened was in recent months, at least 2 companies have very widely stated in internal meetings that a significant portion of the people affected by the layoffs were poor performers. That is very troubling for a couple of reasons. First, let's talk about what happens after you get laid off. Fortunately, in a layoff scenario, you usually get a very nice severance package. Some companies will give you a base number of weeks and then add on a certain number of weeks per year. And depending on how progressive and generous the company is, they may also give you more extended benefits and support in finding new jobs. If the company's outlook doesn't improve and they do more and more rounds of layoffs, those packages get less and less generous. So if you are going to be affected by a layoff, it can be really natural to be like, whew, I survived the first round of layoffs. I am going to say if you're going to get laid off, do it in the first round, because again, that is when the packages are the most generous. And there's also less competition out in the job market. As layoffs continue, there is more and more competition for the fewer and fewer jobs that are available. That's just reality. There's always been a little bit of a stigma to getting laid off, but because companies are so respectful and they never blame the employee for getting laid off, a lot of hiring companies don't count it against the person. Now, you'll see on LinkedIn, there's, a little bit of chatter about certain executives or hiring managers bad-mouthing people who've been laid off and not wanting to hire them. That's going to happen, unfortunately. But for the most part, it doesn't end your career just because you've been laid off, especially when in the industry you're in, there's a lot of layoffs happening. People don't tend to view you as critically. I will say that it's easier to find a job if you have a job, and if you've been laid off, there's going to be a little bit more scrutiny on you. But if you had a lot of tenure at the company you came from, that frankly doesn't tend to matter as much. If you've been there more than a few years and you were part of layoffs, usually hiring managers and recruiters aren't going to count that against you. I'm obviously leading up to something. But when you have CEOs or other major executives at large companies saying that people who were laid off were poor performers, that changes everything. That impacts people's future job prospects. And it can impact that both for people who were the poor performers and people who were part of the layoffs who weren't poor performers. And no one knows. Think about it. Your recruiter, your hiring manager, nobody knows if you're coming from one of these companies who said this, if you're one of the people who is a poor performer, or if you were just in a redundant role or part of a team that had overhired. That's really unfortunate. That can absolutely taint your ability to find a new job. So these announcements by these companies were met with a lot of blowback in the business industry because it's just not done. You don't blame the people for getting laid off because at the end of the day, you hired them, you trained them, and you kept them and you didn't manage them out. Part of the blowback was a lot of people were saying, well, that's a management responsibility if the company overhired or the company didn't manage out poor performers, which then impacts the company's performance, right? So I would say my opinion, if it's not clear, is that this is in very poor taste. It is a wrong thing to do for the terminated employees. It's incredibly disrespectful. And the biggest takeaway from the business community at large was this decrease in confidence in senior leaders' ability to manage middle management and middle management's ability to manage poor performers. So if we look back and we think about how companies are structured, let's talk about how layoffs work. If you know this already, forgive me, but this may be new information to some of you. So yes, every company is organized into a pyramid structure to some extent. You obviously want the fewest people at the top and the most people on the bottom. That's just the way it works. So when executive leadership makes the decision decision to do layoffs, they land on a percentage or a raw number, one way or another. Some companies pretend like that's not what they do. That's what happens. And then they cascade down that information. At different companies, that decision of who within that number is made at different levels. Often it is not made as at low of a level as people think. Depending on how the company is structured, I would say that it's usually at the SVP level and sometimes at the VP level that the names are attached. They will sometimes consult with senior directors and directors and occasionally with managers if there's ambiguity or if they're unsure about something. This can cause a lot of mistakes because it is a reality that when you do layoffs, you of course want to select out some of the poorest performers, but they're mixed in with some regrettable layoffs as well. So the interesting thing about this circumstance with these two companies is they were saying the quiet part out loud. Everyone knows that when you have to do layoffs, it is an opportunity to eliminate employees who don't perform well, but for some reason you can't manage them out. This is where it gets really tricky, and this is why companies usually don't say this, is because it can be seen as a punitive action where they would have had a lot more, perhaps legal repercussions if they terminated the person's employment. I hope that makes sense. I'm being very careful about how I say this. So a lot of times companies are very, very leery of workforce lawsuits. And so sometimes they don't terminate people that they may otherwise terminate if it's a little bit ambiguous or unclear, or if the performance issues aren't well documented and that person is a member of a protected class. So if you're trying to fire someone for performance reasons and they are a member of a protected class of employee, it's very, very difficult, and you have to have a lot of paper trail. And it depends on how cautious the company you work for is and how cautious your HR department is. So a lot of times companies, when layoff time comes, they do take the opportunity to eliminate employees that they're not that fond of for one reason or another, but don't necessarily have the justification for a termination, or, I'm just going to be honest, the balls for it. So they use the layoffs as an excuse. Keep that in mind. Saying the quiet part out loud may seem like a courageous act, but it isn't, because you're branding everybody in the layoff with this tainted reputation because you're not announcing, well, if 60% of the people laid off were poor performers, which ones were they? All of the people in that layoff group are going to be perceived that way. So that's the first thing I want to touch on about why the layoffs right now are so different. Let's move into the second part of this. It was really interesting because as some of this was going down and as more and more layoffs have been happening over the last few months, I was on LinkedIn and I saw a recruiter post that this is the worst thing she's ever seen. The numbers of people being laid off and the amount of time it's taking people to find a new home. She says this is the worst she's ever seen, including the tech crash of the early 2000s. I don't know if I agree with that. So I'm going to share a personal story here. I was working in technology in the late 90s and early 2000s. Yes, I am that old. I went through the layoffs of the early 2000s. I was going through this at a time where I was in a developer role at a not particularly financially successful company that was being backed by a very successful company with a lot of resources. The company had started with a lot of confidence from the parent company. They thought this was a sellable model, basically. And as technology started bubbling and then crashing, it became clear that not all the companies had the same potential. So if you think back to the early 2000s, remember there was this huge tech bubble and people were just throwing money at Silicon Valley and at tech startups and just at anything because no one knew what was going to take off and what wasn't. And this was back when companies, this is going to sound crazy if you didn't live through this, but companies would get funding and they frankly had no business model. Like they would get all this investment money, but they didn't have any business plan for how they were then going to turn a profit. It was frankly all based on faith. It was all smoke and mirrors. At the time, everybody knew the internet was going to be this huge thing, but nobody knew what to do with it. And so people were just throwing money at all these companies because the ones that were going to take off, those are the ones that turned into the Amazons and the Facebooks. We know how that went. But what people don't talk about is the thousands of tech companies that had no monetization model and just fizzled out. And even Google struggled with how they were going to monetize and be profitable at first. Even Yahoo did. So a lot of the early startups, they just knew they had a cool idea, but had no way to monetize it. This was before a lot of ad revenue on websites. This is long before subscription models. So people were just putting stuff up on the internet for free, but it costs them money. So you see what I'm saying about the business model? They just didn't have one. Small digression. But what happened is when those companies eventually started to fail, when the investor confidence decreased, thousands of tech companies imploded. Their funding dried up and they had no way to turn a profit and pay people. So this was an interesting time. I had a lot of friends at the time who went to work at startups in Silicon Valley. Some of them made a ton of money. Some of them went through a few busts. It was exciting and scary and risky all at once, but you never knew what risk was going to pay off. So the company I was working for, I did not think it was going to pay off. I did not think they were going to be the next big thing, but it was an interesting service they provided. And they were an offshoot of a very large company, which is very different than trying to find external funding. So a lot more safe, basically. And I've always liked safety. So at this company, we went through our first round of layoffs at this company in the early 2000s was horrific. I mean, 60 to 70% of the company got laid off in the first round of layoffs. It was awful. And then we spent about 3 years having regular layoffs. The first year, I think it was almost every Friday we would have another round of layoffs. And again, we'd lost so much of the company at that point, they were just like whittling and whittling down. I survived the layoffs because I was young, I was cheap, and I had a very adaptable skill set. And I was so proud of the fact that I had survived so many rounds of layoffs. Not proud like I looked down on the people who didn't. I knew that those decisions were outside my control and frankly had nothing to do with my contributions or value to the company. It was just that I was cheaper and had a flexible skill set. So a lot of people who were older and making a ton more money, they're going to be the first to go sometimes. Or if they have roles where the company is deciding to offload certain pieces of work, those roles are just eliminated. The important thing to note here is how long this went on. And this wasn't unusual to my company, but my company at the time was a particularly rough example of what was happening, which is that people were just getting cut. And the tech industry was taking a huge hit, such a huge hit that I personally knew people who got laid off who they may not have found an equivalent job for years, like literally years. So when recruiters are saying on LinkedIn that this is some of the worst they've ever seen, that's not what it looks like to me, but I'm not seeing the heavy, deep cuts. I'm not seeing the entire companies collapsing. I'm not seeing that the jobs are completely dried up. There's just a shift in some of the technical jobs, for example. So I'm not sure this is the worst I've ever seen, but it's bad out there. It may not be worse than the early 2000s. It may be worse than the early 2000s, but the fact that that's the comparison should tell you how bad it is right now. And I know that the job numbers in the US are pretty good right now. That's true. But there are certain shifts that are happening right now that are frankly troubling. Let's talk about what those shifts are. So this is another part of why are the layoffs so different right now? I know everyone is tired of hearing about AI. Part of the reason everybody's tired of hearing it is because it's not turning into anything useful yet. It's a lot of vaporware, to be honest. That doesn't mean that it's not impacting you in ways that you may not actually know. One of the things that I've observed with a lot of companies that I've worked with, spoken to, is that there's a huge quiet shift in funding. So some companies are spending millions, hundreds of millions, and even in the billions of dollars investing in AI right now. Okay, Gabby, what's wrong with that? That's great. Well, I don't see that that's turning into jobs for people. I'm not hearing a bunch of hiring. Yes, put AI on your resume and it's a lot easier to get hired right now. But this is a quiet shift in funding and in research. What that means with a shift in funding is that other things are not getting funded. I know that sounds obvious, but I'm not seeing people talk about it, and the people I'm talking to aren't realizing that that's the opportunity cost of AI right now, is that companies are moving their spending into AI research and AI innovation and away from certain kinds of projects. So large-scale software implementations, for example, have really dried up. And there's a whole industry wrapped around large-scale software implementations. In fact, multiple industries are tied up in that. So what you see is a lot of solution integrators, consulting companies. That's why a lot of these ancillary companies are taking such a huge hit, is because of the shift in spending. And we're not getting an equivalent external spend on AI. It's not going back to the same places. Now, are those companies trying to adapt? Yeah, they're trying to. But again, the shifts aren't equivalent. What people are also missing is that that's an early indicator, and that started over a year ago. So the shifts in spending started a while ago. And that's why consulting has taken such a hit for a lot longer than some of the other industries. So consulting, software implementations, that kind of thing. And the shift in spending isn't just because of AI, right? We've got high interest rates, we've got some, financial uncertainty, so people aren't investing as much. So there's a couple other factors. It's not just AI that's causing the shift in spending, but AI is one of the single biggest shifts in spending that is impacting these ancillary industries. What happens then is a cascade effect, where it starts with these external spending, and then it moves into internal roles and shifts in investment in internal roles. And so that's why some of these companies are bundling in layoffs, where they're actually eliminating old skill sets and freeing up money to spend on AI. So the publicly traded company I mentioned, that is one of the things that they are doing, is they're reducing unneeded skill sets. The skill sets are unneeded because that company is no longer investing in those types of projects and in that kind of technical need. We'll leave it at that. And they're shifting the money over here, and then they're going to boost hiring for these AI roles. So that was also part of the blowback in some of these recent layoffs, is why aren't they reskilling the employees? Well, this next part is all my own theory. But I believe companies are so frustrated that they were held hostage by an employee-driven hiring economy for the last few years. I think those companies are having a little blowback to that as well. So they don't want to reskill expensive employees. They'd rather eliminate those expensive employees, bring on, I'm just going to say younger, but the polite way to say it is earlier career folks who they believe are more adaptable to learning and using AI or innovating with AI. This leads me to one of my next major points that I'll get to in a second, because this is concerning in a number of ways. So I think that it's a combination of pragmatism, where they recognize that it might be better to have lower cost employees who are more adaptable and can learn AI. Or if those AI employees are already trained and exist out there, great. But it's a new technology. Nobody's like an expert on it yet, right? But I also think that some of this is built up resentment over what some in-demand skill sets have been asking for salaries for a very long time. We've seen a lot of salary bloat in certain technical skill sets in the last few years. And I think we all know that. There's been certain pockets of technical skill sets where people have been able to command, frankly, outrageous salaries. I've known companies that couldn't hire certain roles because in my head, that role should be at like $150K, $200K, and people are asking $350, $400K. So the last few years has gotten really bloated. There's just been a lot of salary bloat for certain kinds of skill sets. And I think companies are frustrated and resent it, and they're taking this opportunity to right-size some salaries. So some of it's pragmatism, some of it I think is like a little bit of like emotion around this. And it's just an interesting trend to see how much salary bloat there was, and then to see how hard companies are frankly trying to undercut what people should be getting paid. Because I think, as always, the answer is somewhere in the middle in terms of value. And as people will tell you, value is what someone's willing to pay for something. But right now, there's a lot of pressure from a lot of companies, and you'll see this on LinkedIn. People are posting outrageously low offers they're getting, and it's kind of gross. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of disgusting. I get it. I was hiring when some of these salaries were out of control, but I just didn't pay it, and I was under a lot of pressure from some of my leadership to over-title people so that they could get higher salaries because they were exceeding the salary band. And I just thought it wasn't worth it. I'm glad. I was conservative in hiring. I was conservative in over-titling in salary. And that meant that a lot of my hires were safe when a lot of other people weren't. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, not just as a person who likes to make money, but also as a leader and thinking about making good decisions for your company and good decisions for your people. And when there's a bubble that's about to burst, that is not the time to be hiring too many people and to be hiring people at too high of salaries, because you're going to have to get rid of people you just hired. And that sucks. That sucks. And there's something to be said for a little bit of a more old-fashioned perspective on leadership. This is something that's fallen out of date, and I don't hear it talked about as much. But as a leader, if you have to let a lot of people go, whether it's through firing an individual employee or doing these group layoffs, that's a failure on your part. And when I was coming up through management and when I was learning and developing my leadership skills, this was frankly an area of integrity and honor that I really internalized. It's also a perspective you have to balance, where if you hire an employee and they checked all the boxes and they had a great interview and then they don't have the skill set, and as a leader, you give them the feedback and you give them the tools and the resources, at some point it's on them what they do with that if you've done your part in investing in it. And some old hardliners would say, well, even then you failed them because you couldn't, quote unquote, fix them. Well, that's one area where I am new school, which is that I'm like, the other person bears responsibility for their development, but as a leader, it's your job to give them opportunities, skills, resources, coaching, and feedback. But what they do with that, that is on them. So if I do all of that and I have to terminate or lay off an employee for performance reasons, I don't feel bad about that. But if I've overhired or if I've oversalaried and then there's some contraction in salary, absolutely that's my fault. It's not their fault for asking. It's your fault for doing it if you know it's not sustainable. And I've seen that happen. And unfortunately, that is what we're seeing happen right now with some of these layoffs. So let's talk about the part that is hard as an older person. And this is one of the major differences between now and the early 2000s. So when you think about the early 2000s, tech was a young person's game. A lot of the innovation and a lot of the risks were being driven by people who were in their 20s and 30s. It was a young person's game back then. And you might have some of the older people as investors and, some graybeards as advisors, but it was a young industry back then, obviously, right? Well, now here we are, well over 20 years later. And in the tech landscape, it is a wider age range. So if you think back to who was getting laid off in the early 2000s or who, was losing their companies or their companies were going under and they lost their jobs, they were people in their 20s, sometimes early 30s at that point in time. Now it's very different. A lot of people affected by layoffs are in their 40s and 50s. And one of the things that is harder now is when we talk about people are taking a long time to find new employment, that is specifically in that age group of people in their 40s and 50s. So that's a major difference in what's happening with layoffs right now, is that a lot of people in their 40s and 50s are getting laid off. They have higher salaries, that makes sense. But they are absolutely struggling the most to find new homes. And there's a statistic out there that companies are strongly preferring to hire Gen Z right now and train them up. And a lot of people are like, yeah, they want people who are more trainable, blah, blah, blah. No, they want people who are cheaper and they can underpay Gen Z. And in some cases, it's not underpayment, it's just lower salary because there's less experience. But then they also don't have to deal with a lot of later in life issues. So again, ageism is discriminatory, but it's very hard to prove ageism in hiring. And so even though you see these numbers and it's a trend and companies are disproportionately hiring Gen Z, and again, no knock against Gen Z, by the way, this is not their fault and they need jobs too, right? But it is rough when you've got people who are in their 40s and 50s and who are not close enough to retirement that they can just say bygones and retire early. And yeah, that's a grim outlook. And there's a lot of changes in the housing market specifically right now where because interest rates have been kept so high, home purchases have slowed down and house values are coming down, which is great. I do want millennials and Gen Z to be able to buy houses. I really, really do. I want there to be a balance for everybody. I don't want to see people in their 50s forced out of their homes because they can't get jobs and they got laid off, and not getting the value out of their homes because with the layoffs and the job pressure comes lower house values. So it's a sad time for a lot of older folks, and that really tugs at my heart. And it's hard to see that much experience is being completely ignored by companies that are led by people that are in that same age range. So I just want that to sink in for just a second. The people making these decisions are in that same age group. It's kind of a bummer, right? So yeah, that is one of the other major differences in layoffs right now, is that it is disproportionately affecting certain age ranges that are a little bit more vulnerable to, I'm just going to say, nefarious or unfair hiring practices. So it's a bad outlook for some people right now. And I hope that this changes. This is also impacted by one of the other shifts in layoffs that is being quietly talked about, but I think needs to be more loudly talked about, which is that there's this huge elimination of middle management. I find this very interesting. So you're going to say, Gabby, you just told me about a company that was resisting eliminating middle management. Yes. That is the exception. There is a trend that's happening right now where more and more companies, as part of their layoffs, are now disproportionately laying off middle management. Again, they're older, they're more expensive, but there's also this perspective that as we move more and more into an AI world, there's less need for middle management. If you want to go back and watch my Is AI Coming for Your Job video, we talk about it in that video, which is that there is a theory that with the rise of AI being used within companies, there is less need for middle management. I think that is ridiculous. It is. And in that video, I specifically state that this is going to be a bit of a pendulum swing, that a lot of companies are going to jump on this bandwagon because it's financially attractive to them to get rid of a whole layer of people who are a bit expensive as well. But that's not going to work well. We know that self-organizing teams don't work like that. That's not how that works. People, unfortunately, need to be led and managed. I actually wish this wasn't true. That is one of the most annoying parts of leadership, is the fact that you have to herd the cats all the time, right? We have that expression for a reason. It is really annoying. So it'd be great if we didn't have to do that. But AI isn't going to fix that. That is completely a bananas theory and expectation. AI can't even do low-level assistant functions right now, and people are changing their job structures within their companies based on something that hasn't even been realized yet, and would take a decade or more to get to a level of effectiveness where middle managers aren't needed. So I'm laughing about this because it's frankly horrible. It's a bad theory. Nobody's doing studies to prove whether or not it's true. It goes against everything you learn about people management and leadership and organizational psychology. It is just the dumbest move I've seen in a long time. But unfortunately, that is pushing more and more people in that sensitive age group that I'm talking about out into the wild, is this reduction of middle management. So it's really interesting to me because when I made that AI video, I hadn't seen a lot of companies doing it yet, but that was one of the things that ChatGPT specifically told me was going to happen. Well, ChatGPT was right, and I have a feeling that a lot of these executives, for whatever reason, are actually taking advice from AI about what to do with AI, because we're seeing a lot of really bananas decisions being made right now in some really established companies. So I'm going to do another video, which is why companies are so freaked out about AI and doing dumb things because of it, because that is a whole topic in and of itself. But this is one of those things, which is trying to eliminate an entire management layer. And that's attractive to CEOs. And it's attractive because, like I said, it's a whole band of people. Middle management's a fairly heavy layer of people, but also it's a highly salaried layer of people. But yeah, it's going to be a pendulum swing. We'll see a huge reduction in middle management. And then once people realize the chaos that's going to ensue because of it, companies will bring back middle management and they will just rebrand them, right? So it's really funny because I'm going to use an example here. This happened a little bit in the tech world when everybody went to agile development. And they tried to get rid of project managers. It's the same thing. Project managers are basically middle management for projects, right? So they tried to get rid of project managers, and then they're like, oh, Scrum Masters do the same thing. No, they don't. Scrum Masters do not do the same thing. Scrum Master is a very, very important role if you're doing agile development. But any Scrum Master worth their salt will tell you, I'm not a project manager. So these roles work hand in hand. You've got your project manager, your product manager, and your Scrum Master. And what they did, a lot of companies did, was they laid off their whole PMOs. They laid off so many project managers because Scrum Masters will do that job. They did not do that job. And so then they started bringing project managers back and then trying to call them Scrum Masters. And a lot of project managers would get in and they would take a Scrum Master role and then they were basically asked to be project managers. It was a huge nightmare. So again, companies will eliminate entire layers, regret it later, quietly bring those people back and try and brand them as a different role. So I'm interested to see what happens in middle management. And again, if you want to hear more about this, go watch my AI video. We get super in depth on a lot of this. But yeah, that is one of the big final differences in what we're seeing in layoffs right now is that layoffs are always a time to shrink middle management. It is usually proportionate to team shrinkage. And right now, except for that one company I mentioned, it's disproportionately middle management. Now, do I think middle management shakeup is good? Usually, yes. I think there are a lot of people who are coasting in middle management roles. I'm sorry to say this out loud, but I've worked with a lot of them and they are. But again, this is what it comes back to for me. You need to have easily measurable targets for your middle management. And then you need to hold them accountable for those targets. What I see happening is that senior leaders are so out of touch with what's happening below them that they retain middle managers who are not performing, who are not hitting those targets because they believe it is more disruptive to replace them. It might be more disruptive, but disruption isn't always bad. So I'm a little frustrated with this one because I don't think you should get rid of middle management en masse, but I think this is just a basic business principle, a basic management principle, which is that every layer you should be holding them accountable, and you as a senior leader shouldn't be giving your middle managers underneath you a pass for not hitting their numbers because you don't want to be bothered with replacing them and they do something that you don't understand. That's maybe a sign that you as a senior leader need to get a little bit more in touch. All right, this was a wide-ranging topic. I hope it was interesting. I'm very interested as somebody who's been in this industry for decades in these shifts and these ebbs and flows and these trends. So if you're interested, I'm going to be doing more trend videos because I think analyzing what's happening right now and helping people understand it so they can know how it impacts them is incredibly important. I am going to say one more thing about layoffs. I know I mentioned that you're better off getting laid off in the first round because you get better packages and there's less competition for open jobs. Totally true. And what I did is I held on to that company for so long because I believed the hype that there wasn't a lot of jobs out there and I didn't believe in myself. I was young. I believe in myself now, obviously, but I didn't then. And I stayed there longer than I should have. And it worked out for me in some ways and in other ways it didn't. I probably lost a good 10 years of some real financial security that I could have built for myself because I stayed at a company that wasn't paying me what I should have been paid. And so it would have been scary to take a new job, but it probably would have been better for me financially. I would have been building more wealth at a younger age. Hindsight's 20/20. And at the time, I often wondered whether I should jump or not. But it was so interesting because I'd gotten so stuck in survival mode. I'd gotten so stuck in surviving these rounds of layoffs that I never asked myself, am I thriving? And I wasn't. And I should have left. It was not a good company to stay at. It was, frankly, very traumatic. And I had to work through a lot of, not to be dramatic, I had to work through a lot of PTSD after I left that company because I was so traumatized by the constant layoffs, by being in survival mode for so long, and then by working for a company which wasn't well run and had a lot of issues because of it, not just the layoffs. So Yeah, ask yourself, what am I holding on to? Because yes, you can do everything in your power to make yourself layoff proof, which is having these really adaptable and transferable skill sets, being very useful, exceeding your targets. There's so much you can do to try and make yourself layoff proof. But I'm going to tell you, it doesn't keep you safe forever. And if you're in this older age group, your job's on the line no matter what. That's just the reality of how layoffs are working in this day and age. I know that should be illegal, but that is what people are doing. So I'm just going to say that out loud. So yeah, you can try and be layoff proof and it will work until it doesn't. And you can't prevent it from happening. And if it's going to, earlier is better. But also, speaking from experience, you're going to turn yourself inside out trying to be safe. And safe isn't always good. Sometimes change is better. As scary as it is. There were so many people, I'm going to come full circle now. There are so many people who got laid off that were my friends and peers at that company who genuinely said over and over again that getting laid off was the best thing to happen to them. They landed at companies that valued them more, paid them better, treated them better. They were able to have better experiences somewhere else and grow their careers in directions that they hadn't anticipated. So I'm just going to put that out there, that if you're worried about layoffs, it isn't always the worst thing that can happen to you, as much as it seems like it is. And if you do get laid off, absolutely take that as an opportunity to do some soul searching and figure out if there's something better or different that you should be doing with your life. Because we tend to get on these paths, and some of us tend to just hold on to them when really a change is much better. I want to hear from you in the comments about your experiences with the layoffs that are happening right now. And also let me know if you want me to do a video specifically on what to do if you're laid off, because I know that that's impacted a lot of people. I haven't gotten a lot of questions from our viewers about it, so I'd love to know if that's something that you'd be interested in. So thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I hope this was helpful, and I do intend to do more trend videos, so if you don't want more trend videos, tell me and I won't do them. All right, thanks so much, everybody. Bye.